my pleasure to introduce our third speaker in this session, Daniel Ansari. Daniel's a professor at the University of Western Ontario in the Mind and Brain Center Institute, right? It's not a center, it's an institute. And Daniel's come a couple of times to talk to McMaster, and he studies, does number sense matter, but I think what I find more interesting things that Daniel does is about innumeracy. The idea that the world is in uproar when we have illiterate children, but it doesn't seem to matter too much when they have innumerate children. One of the things Daniel's done is really come up with a measure of numeracy or numerical fluency. Are you going to talk about that? Yeah, and I think that's a great contribution to the field and to society. So, welcome to Daniel.
Much, David, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm not going to be talking about data from college students, so if you're interested in college students, you might want to go for an early college break because coffee break, because I'm going to be talking about very young kids. But before I delve into the science, I just want to sort of remind you of how much you use your basic intuitions about numbers in your everyday lives. We often forget about that when we think about numeracy and mathematics as something that's restricted to the classroom, but it's actually a highly adaptive skill that we acquire over the course of learning and development. So one everyday situation that we all encounter is we have to do our grocery shopping. And we also try to stay healthy, so we might buy fruit and we might decide how many fruit we need on a given day to keep our family healthy for the rest of the week. Now, if it's a busy Monday afternoon and you're rushing to go back home, you know you still have to prepare dinner, you might just grab some apples, you know this is roughly how many I need. That's when you're using a sort of approximate sense of quantity. On a Saturday morning, you might feel more leisurely and you're also a bit more budget conscious, so you might actually count out those apples. Now you're using an exact understanding of number and count-based enumeration strategies. Those two strategies we use interchangeably in our daily lives without necessarily thinking that it's got anything to do with our understanding of number. We just use that skill in order to inform our behavior. If you saw this numerical information on your alarm clock this morning, you were probably going to be late. Well, I was definitely going to be late if I saw that because my train left an hour and a half before that. So here's again an example of a numerical stimuli that informs our decision making and our behavior in important ways. We have good reasons to believe that humans are not the only ones who use an understanding of numerical quantity to inform their behavior. Let's say you're a tiger and you're surveying this scene. It's lunchtime. There's several groups of animals that look very tasty, but the groups of animals actually differ in their numerical size. So again, here you might use quantitative cues to inform where to approach, how far those groups are, sort of a trade-off between the distance and the number of animals. Lots of different quantitative dimensions might influence your behavior. And the quality to which you can use those quantitative cues, of course, influences your survival, because this is your food source. If, these days we spend a lot of time looking at the temperature, it never seems to be going up, although some people argue that the cool weather is very nice. Many people use this kind of quantitative information where now you're combining quantitative information across multiple columns, and we all know that this type of information is very important for informing our behaviors, for our futures, and we also know the consequences of when people are misrepresenting this kind of information. And the long-term repercussions that might have. And finally, there are numbers that are just really, really strange. I have to note that my citizenship is German. So how important are our basic numerical abilities, now that I've sort of refreshed your memory, that you use them in everyday lives to guide your behavior, and not just in the context of a classroom? Well, there's lots of data to suggest that literacy is really important. We all believe that it's really important to teach our children to read, and it clearly is. But numeracy, has been shown, is just as important. So here's some statistics. This is from a big report by Binner and Parson in the UK, in which they were able to show that low numeracy increases the probability of unemployment, physical illness, depression, and incarceration. So negative life outcomes, if you like. The OECD, many of you are familiar with the OECD in the context of the PISA study, And of course, in the context of the PISA study, it's possible to track educational achievement over time and to correlate that with growth in economic indicators such as the GDP. And they've been able to show that growth in mathematical competence within nations is positively correlated to economic growth. So there's a correlation here as well. KPMG, the management consultancy, was tasked by the UK government to estimate the cost of low numeracy to the UK government, and they found that they estimated that in lost tax revenues, low numeracy cost the UK government about £2.4 billion per year, which is a relatively large sum. Another domain which I don't think we typically think of as being important is the domain of healthcare. There's a long line of research suggesting that literacy is really important for patients as well as healthcare professionals. But now there's research showing that numeracy is also very important, and it makes sense if you think about a nurse in an emergency room having to read numerical information of an instrument, translate that into an action. That the quality of their ability to represent that information and translate it into action will affect the patient. So I think these stats show that numeracy is really important, so we have to think about ways in which we can improve numeracy abilities from an early age. So this leads me on to the notion of foundational competencies. So here, we in the domain of number processing really borrow very heavily from the domain of reading, where a lot more progress has been made. And one of the things that we've tried to ask over the past few years is, what are the early foundations of our basic numerical intuitions? What are some of the scaffolding factors? What are some of the representational primitives, the bases upon which children construct mature representations of number that they then use in the context, for example, of calculation? And the analogy we draw here is really to phonological awareness, where there's been this explosion in the literacy and research on literacy, showing that even pre-readers, phonological awareness is related to their subsequent abilities to connect phonemes to graphemes and to eventually become fluent readers. And it's this notion of this cumulative effect, that if you do not have the early foundations, you're going to be lagging behind for a very long time. Another way of showing that or demonstrating this notion of foundational competencies is to consider the Matthew effect in reading, which was initially put forward by Keith Stanovich from Boise in Toronto, who showed that children who lack foundational skills, phonological awareness, phonics skills, early in development continue to lag behind. They have a much more shallow developmental trajectory than those kids who start out with good foundational competencies. So the question is whether the same is true in numeracy as well, and specifically what those foundational competencies are. One of the best ways of really asking questions about foundational competencies is to go back to the very beginning of human development and to study infants. And for decades now, psychologists have developed sophisticated ways for looking inside the infant mind. And one of the most popular ways is looking times, to essentially habituate infants to a particular stimuli by repeating it over and over again, and then seeing whether they notice a change in that stimulus. So how would you do that in the domain of number? Well, let's consider this example here. This is research by Shu and Spelke from 2000. What they did is they repeatedly showed 6-month-old infants displays of 16 dots. Of course, the infant didn't know that there were 16 dots. And over the repetition, what they varied was not the number of dots, but the spatial arrangements of the dots, the individual area, their density, and so forth, so that the only thing that remained constant over the habituation stream, over the repetition of these 16 dots, was the number of dots in the displays. And all the time, the researchers were measuring the looking times of the infants towards this display. So after some time, what happens in these habituation experiments is that infants get bored, they start to look away. What the experimenter then does is to introduce a novel numerosity. In this case, it's 8 dots. And the question is now, do infants start to get re-interested in the display? Have they noticed a change from 16 to 8 dots? And what Shu and Spelke found was that indeed, infants can discriminate between 8 and 16 dots when they're 6 months of age, but they can't discriminate between 8 and 12 dots. And that's a very important difference in their discrimination acuity, in their their ability to discriminate, because it turns out that there's a fundamental difference between 8 and 16 and 8 and 12, and that can be described as the numerical distance between them. So the numerical distance between 8 and 16 is 8, and the numerical distance between 8 and 12, of course, is 4. It turns out that over developmental time, infants become increasingly better at discriminating smaller and smaller distances. So by 9 months of age, infants can now discriminate between 8 versus 10, but they can't discriminate between 8 versus 12, sorry, but they can't discriminate between 8 versus 10. So there seems to be some refinement in their discrimination abilities. Another way of asking about foundational competencies is, of course, to look across species to try and ask the question whether there are any phylogenetic constraints on our basic numerical abilities, whether their evolution, in a sense, has, over evolutionary time, there's been the construction of a system for number representation. And there's tons of work on this. I won't bore you with all of the details, but just show you one piece of data here from Jessica Cantillon's work together with Liz Brannan, where they trained monkeys to discriminate between arrays of dots, to simply choose the larger of two dot arrays to perform a number discrimination task. And what they found, just like the infants, is that these monkeys can do these dot discriminations, and that their performance is also influenced by this parameter of numerical distance. So what you can see in this chart here is that these monkeys were significantly slower when numbers were very close together, when the numerical difference or distance between two dot arrays was 1, and then there's this parametric decrease in the reaction time. They get faster and faster as the numbers become more and more different. And this parameter of numerical distance has for a very long time been used to describe number representations. In data with human adults, human children, it's been shown time and time again that whether you ask individuals to discriminate which of two numbers is larger or which of two dot arrays is larger, you reliably find this numerical distance effect. And this in turn has led to the postulation that underlying our basic number discrimination abilities is what some refer to as an approximate number system, where somewhere in our minds there's a mental number line, and along this mental number line numbers are represented. But critically, numbers are not represented in a digital form, but rather in an analog form. So you can imagine that each number representation has a Gaussian distribution associated with it, which means that when an animal or an infant or an adult perceives 9 dots, a place on the number line is activated. But this place on the number line is also activated when the animal perceives 10 dots or 8 dots, but less when the animal perceives 12 dots or 6 dots. This then, in turn, creates an overlap between representations that are close to one another, as you can see in this sort of cartoon figure here, of this notion of this mental number line, this analog representation of number, whereby the overlap between 5 and 6 is greater than the overlap between 3 and 9, and that might then explain for the distance effects. So, just to provide you with an interim summary, in terms of foundational system, we know that there's a basic sensitivity to numerical magnitude. It's there from infancy onwards. It's measurable in other species. It's been termed the approximate number system because of the distance effect, suggesting that representations are analog rather than digital. And it's been often termed the number sense. Indeed, Stanislas Dehaene, a pioneer in this field, has a whole book called The Number Sense, which beautifully summarizes all this evidence. But from an educational perspective, the question is, does it matter? So we know in the field of reading that phonological awareness is really critical. But are these basic, non-symbolic discrimination abilities, are they related to children's math learning? So are individual differences in how good children are at discriminating between dot arrays, or indeed between Arabic numerals, symbolic representations of number, are they related to their classroom-relevant math achievement? Now, we and others have been asking this in multiple ways. I just want to introduce you to one way in which we go about this. This is work by my former graduate student, Nadia Nosworthy, who's now an assistant professor in Michigan. And what Nadia did for her PhD was she said, I want to build a usable tool that can measure number discrimination. So we decided to go back to basic and design a paper and pencil test. This is 2 pages here of the paper and pencil test. It's actually the practice page. And what children have to do in this test is to simply take a pencil and cross out the larger of 2 dot arrays or the larger of 2 Arabic numerals as quickly and as accurately as they can, We use a stopwatch, we give them 1 minute per condition, and there's 56 items per condition. And then we simply score the total number of items correct. And as you can see from this page, they're being instructed on how to do this, so that when eventually they start, they have a good understanding of the task. As one of the early studies of her PhD, Nadia tested 160 first to third graders to first of all see how performance on this test changes over developmental time, but most critically, whether individual differences in performance on this test are correlated with individual differences on standardized tests of math achievement. In this case, she used the Woodcock-Johnson Math Fluency and the Woodcock-Johnson Math Calculation Test. The Woodcock-Johnson Math Fluency is a speeded math test. You have to do as many arithmetic problems as you can in a time limit, I think, of 3 minutes. And the Woodcock-Johnson Calculation Test is a test where children are given as much time as they like to complete the test. I can tell you, maybe some of you have administered this, this test can be very frustrating with children who have an approach to their work which is very meticulous, which is very laudable, but they can take up to 10 or 15 minutes before they're happy to say that they do not need to complete any further items on this test. But it's an important contrast between speeded and unspeeded math performance, especially because our test is a speeded test of number discrimination. So using this cross-sectional data then, Nadia was able to ask the question, does this 2-minute magnitude processing test correlate with math achievement? And what she found was that indeed it does. There's a correlation here between individual differences in performance on the magnitude comparison task and math fluency scores. I'm showing here residual math fluency scores because we residualize them for chronological age because of the large age difference for first to third grade, but in each separate grade we find the same association. Now with math fluency you might say, well, the test is speeded, the test of number comparison is speeded, and the test of arithmetic is speeded. So let's also look at the unspeeded measure, the calculation test. And again, we see a significant association between individual differences on our 2-minute paper and pencil test and individual differences on the Woodcock-Johnson calculation test. Now, one of the follow-up things that we did was to say, well, we took the total score of symbolic and non-symbolic, so dot comparison and digit comparison. Let's look at the relative amounts of variance explained by each. So we entered them into a multiple regression, symbolic and non-symbolic, both as predictors of the math outcome measures. And what we found is, of course, both correlate, but the multiple regression clearly showed that only symbolic accounts for unique variance in individual differences in children's arithmetic. And it does so over and above working memory, intelligence, and reading abilities. So we also had measures of those key constructs that we already know are critical correlates of individual differences in math abilities. So this then suggests to us that it's the processing of number symbols that's critical. Maybe it's not so much the sort of innate, phylogenetically constrained representation of non-symbolic number, but that instead it's the process of connecting that system, the non-symbolic system, with the symbolic system. And that children who struggle to make that link are also those who struggle to then use those symbols in the context of calculation. Now, one of the issues here is, I should point out, this is not an isolated finding. There's now lots and lots of data. We summarized this in a review in Trends in Neuroscience and Education last year, where people have contrasted the relative contributions of symbolic and non-symbolic to individual differences in children's math skills. And there seems to be clear evidence now that symbolic number processing is more important than non-symbolic number processing, suggesting that it's perhaps this developmental process of mapping that really counts. Now, one of the problems we perceive with this early work is that it's purely correlational. And we wanted to go a little bit further and to see whether individual differences in early performance on this test predict math achievement over time. And we were really fortunate that the Toronto District School Board allowed us to test 268 children in senior kindergartens, the year before children enter elementary school, on this paper and pencil task. They came from a family of school, NW1 family of schools in Toronto, and we were even luckier that the school board then signed a research agreement with us, where we got access to the students' grade 1 first progress reports. as well as their second term grades. So what we can do now is we can ask the question, well, do individual differences in children's performance on the paper and pencil task in senior kindergarten, do they correlate with future performance as assessed by the teacher? And I think that's very important as well, because it provides a more ecologically valid measure of their math achievement, how well they do actually in the classroom, or how well the teachers perceive that they do. So then we can ask the question, does performance in senior kindergarten actually predict first grade teacher-rated performance? So 6 months later, these children have barely been in school. The teachers just give a very elementary rating of whether they think the students are progressing with difficulties, progressing well, or progressing very well. So what I've plotted here is the performance of children. I don't know if I can use this. Okay, I'll try to explain it. In the column where you see progressing with difficulty, the black bars is the performance in senior kindergarten on the symbolic version of the test, and the white bars is the performance in senior kindergarten on the non-symbolic test. So you can see that there's sort of a main effective group whereby children who are rated as progressing very well perform much better than those on both versions of the test as those who were rated as progressing with difficulty. There's also a difference between those children who were rated as progressing well and those who were rated as progressing very well. But what you can see is, particularly in the group of children who are progressing with difficulties, the largest difference you see there is in the symbolic version of the test. So the symbolic version of the test is best at discriminating between children who are rated by their teachers as progressing with difficulties versus those who are progressing very well. So once again, sort of suggesting that the symbolic version of the test is more sensitive to individual differences in achievement. When we then looked at the second term grades, so in Ontario, children get graded on these 4 components in terms of math, number sense, measurement, geometry, and data management. And what we found here was that, again, it was symbolic number discrimination ability in senior kindergarten that most consistently predicted their second term grades. Non-symbolic had significant associations too, but only with number sense and geometry and not with measurement and data management. We're now able to track these children further, and eventually we're going to look at the performance on EQAO scores as well to really sort of try to see the relationship between this very quick and efficient measure in senior kindergarten and future performance. So I think these and other findings support some notion of scaffolding in the domain of numerical cognition and mathematical cognition, whereby numerical magnitude processing provides one really important scaffold for later achievement and can help to build high-level skills. Of course, it's not the only one. Math is a very complex domain. Competencies such as working memory, spatial abilities, phonological awareness play a role as well. So I certainly don't want to stand here and argue that numerical magnitude is the only scaffolding predictor, but I think we have some evidence to suggest here that it's one very important one. So what we've done with our 2-minute paper and pencil test is actually together with 2 undergraduate students, one of who happens to be this incredible web designer. I said, why don't we, and the other one has just done a degree in statistics, so I said, okay, let's take all the data we have from the test and let's ask everybody else who's used the test, and let's create some norms and publish the norms. So if you go to numeracyscreener.org, you can download the test, but you can also access percentile rank data. And if you are working within Ontario, you want to use this test, these data come from London and Toronto, so they should be fairly representative of the local population. But we hope to scale this website up to have more international norms as well, and hopefully to also get more different components of the numeracy screener, not just number comparison. So we're working on that right now. One of the questions I often get asked is, why do you go for paper and pencil? Well, one of the reasons is that paper and pencil is usable on a whole classroom level, unless every child has a laptop in the classroom, which happens in some classrooms. It's much more easy to just hand out the booklets and do whole class administration. But the other reason is that it's also usable in low-income countries. So we've been doing some work for with members of the World Bank who are looking to design tests of basic numeracy skills that can be used in low-income countries. And here's just pilot study that we conducted in India, where you can see that in all sorts of classroom contexts you can use this tool to assess basic numerical foundational competencies. I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about developmental dyscalculia. David mentioned that we're working on this. So first of all, some of you might ask, well, what's developmental dyscalculia? Well, if you know dyslexia, you can probably already guess what developmental dyscalculia is. It's defined as a child with developmental dyscalculia presents with persistent difficulties in even the most basic aspects of mathematics. And they typically present as being below other competencies, such as reading and IQ. That's not to say that there needs to be a full discrepancy. As you may know, that in the domain of learning disabilities, the notion that there needs to be a discrepancy, that children with developmental dyslexia need to be having normal IQ and impaired reading abilities, that has been largely discredited. We expect that children with developmental dyscalculia, that their math impairment will be their strongest impairment. The prevalence is about 5%, so comparable to dyslexia. But the attention being paid to dyscalculia versus dyslexia is strikingly less. Here is an estimate from Birch and Mazzocco that for every 14 publications on developmental dyslexia, there's one on dyscalculia. Now that's from 2007, but I recently talked to Michelle Mazzocco, and she said she recalculated the statistics in 2013, and the ratio was very similar. So we need more people working on developmental dyscalculia. So what underlies developmental dyscalculia? Well, the early models focused very much on domain general competencies, counting knowledge, working memory, all of the things that are really important for math achievement, for any type of achievement. Really, with the exception of counting knowledge, you could take most of this and apply it to any kind of learning domain. More recently, people have asked, well, what about number-specific processes? And the first paper that asked this question was published by Lundell, Bevan, and Butterworth now 10 years ago, and really a seminal paper in the field. What they did is they focused on basic number processing. They had several groups of participants, one group of dyscalculic who was specifically impaired in terms of their calculation abilities, dyslexics who had a specific reading ability deficit, double deficit, so these are children who have both developmental dyslexia and dyscalculia, and typically developing controls who have neither dyslexia or dyscalculia. What they used amongst many measures is a very simple test that I think is extremely elegant for sort of teasing out what might lie at the core of developmental dyscalculia. They used what's referred to as a numerical Stroop task, or a size congruity task, where numbers are printed in different font sizes, and children are either asked to discriminate on the basis of the numerical quantity represented by the symbols and tell me which number is numerically larger, or on the physical size. So you can either attend to number, or you can attend to physical size. So in number comparison, you ask which is numerically larger, in the size comparison, which is physically larger. When they did that, they asked these two questions of the children when they did the comparisons of these numbers printed in different font sizes. They found the following. The green line shows you the performance across all four groups in the size comparison condition. You can see that they're faster than in the number comparison condition. It's an easier task. But most critically, there are absolutely no group differences. So when you ask children to focus on numerical size, that doesn't seem to affect, on physical size, that doesn't seem to affect the dyscalculic children. But as soon as you ask them to focus on the numerical magnitude represented by those symbols, to access in a way the meaning of those symbols, the numerical meaning of those symbols, and to perform the comparison, that's when you see a massive reaction time difference between the last two groups, which are the dyscalculics and the dyslexics, versus the controls and the dyslexics. So it suggests that it is not just any type of number processing that is impaired in developmental dyscalculia, but it's the ability to retrieve the meaning of number from numerical symbols that is critically distinguishes them from other children. So the findings suggest that developmental dyscalculia is a deficit to represent and process numerical magnitude in a typical way, and that a lack of understanding numerical magnitude leads to difficulties in learning numerical expression and maintaining them in memory. So that some of the memory deficits might initially be driven by representational deficits in being able to access numerical magnitude information from symbols, and critically this of course occurs over the course of developmental time, consistent with the notion of scaffolding and foundational competencies. So here's just some data from our own lab where we can really show this very clearly. This is actually data from altogether 1,700 children, cross-sectional sample, grades 1 to 6. In the yellow bars you see dyscalculics, in the red bars you see typically developing controls, and in every single grade dyscalculics are slower at making comparisons between digits than their controls. When it comes to dot comparison, the pattern is less consistent, again suggesting that it's the processing of number symbols that is critically in accessing the meaning of number symbols. So to summarize and conclude, I hope I've shown you that basic numerical magnitude processing is a critical scaffold for the learning of high-level skills. In this case, I've particularly focused on arithmetic. And that is not so much necessarily our basic non-symbolic intuitions about numbers, but that it's how well we've constructed symbolic representations of number and how we can use those symbols and access meaning from symbols. I think there's some data here to suggest that symbolic skills provide a critical scaffold, and I think one of the educational implications is that strengthening numerical magnitude processing early may enhance the developmental trajectory, and that's where we want to move next. So we haven't done any intervention work, but we're in the process of designing some interventions for young children that help them to understand the relationship between symbolic and non-symbolic quantities, and then we can see to what extent those kinds of activities may enhance the developmental trajectory. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, we have time for a few questions.
Thank you very much. This is really interesting, particularly I had an issue with cognitive science, in general, theories where people like Gary, the stuff done with the difference between MLE and dyscalculia, which you usually point to earlier. It's really interesting to look at MLE or dyscalculia going to it as a cognitive deficit. But what we typically do is to select children who have MLD using achievement. So we select a group using achievement, and achievement is what I would call an external measure. It's external to the child. We select an achievement, take a cutoff score, and below that cutoff score we identify a group of children whom we select, we call them something. We conduct a series of studies, really interesting studies, but probably that group of children is probably more heterogeneous cognitively than we would claim in our papers. Right? And you stretch you can stretch that analogy from MLD on the low end through to the high end, the high achievers, and the 89% in the middle, if you use Gary's numbers, of the kids whom we know nothing about. Right?
No, it's an extremely important point that you make, and I think it boils down to that we, influenced perhaps by psychiatry, are thinking very categorical about individual differences in learning when we do that. I mean, oftentimes I think in the educational world, it's considered to be a financial necessity because you've got to have certain labels to certain resources. But from a research point of view, we don't have any really good evidence to suggest that developmental dyscalculics are qualitatively different from what you see in the normal range. We do, however, have evidence that there are some children who present with very persistent difficulties in math over time. So I think, for me, it's becoming less important to look at cutoff scores, but more important to look at stability, to look at growth patterns, and to understand which children essentially show no response to what Catherine Rose referred to as business as usual, just regular classroom instruction. So what's going on with those children? Regarding the heterogeneity, the large, I didn't have time to show it, but with the large study with 1,700 kids, we did do a cluster analysis where we just ran data sort of theory-independent statistics to try and see how heterogeneous are these dyscalculics on all the measures that we have. And we found that there's 6 separate clusters. So that might be an interesting way to go about translating from research into not just diagnosis, but also remediation, if we can turn those cluster analysis into usable tools that, you know, a child does a test and you identify which cluster do they belong to, and therefore which types of interventions are most likely going to succeed for them. That's sort of, you know, 25 years down the line, where you have a much more individualized approach. But I completely agree with you. These cutoffs are by the very nature arbitrary, and by the way, vary greatly between labs. So I would say the best criterion is stability of deficits.
What happens to adults, like adults with dyscalculia?
That's a great question. We know almost, you saw the statistics, 14 publications of dyslexia for one and dyscalculia, so you can imagine we know very little about children. That's where people have started researching. For adults, we almost know nothing. And I think it's a really, really critical question. I think about, you know, many of us in this room are working in faculties of psychology. Psychology requires statistics. If you have dyscalculia, you probably choose not to do psychology because there's a number involved in there. And yet at universities, at least at Western, we don't have any provisions for individuals with developmental dyscalculia, but we have tons for individuals with dyslexia, so that's another area where we need a lot of improvements. Yeah.
Hi Daniel, so really cool data. I have a question on your conclusion, which I found very interesting, like we're doing the same in my lab with developmental trajectories. And I don't know if you have the answer, but maybe a guess, is what do you think will be the impact on developmental trajectory? Do you think there will be a quantitative impact, like maybe we're going to speed up the development or slow down the development? Or do you think that we're going to observe some more qualitative effect, or like kind of like another trajectory that's going to emerge from that?
You mean through the interventions?
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, no guess, right? No
No,
guess. I try.
I hope that we see some sort of effect, and if we don't, that will be interesting as well, because I think some of the conclusions that I've drawn about the scaffolding factors, the really litmus test is the intervention, right? Because this is, even the predictive data is still correlational, so we need that. We need that experimental evidence. And some attempts, you probably know, in the domain of number have failed so far, maybe because the tasks weren't designed, the intervention tasks weren't designed in the right way. So I think that's an important question. I would say, to answer your question at least partially, my prediction would be that the earlier you administer those interventions, the larger their effects because of the extreme cumulative nature of building those symbolic representations of number.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, I just wanted to get a sense of what's the commonality between dyslexia and dyscalculia, or numeracy and literacy in general. So you talked a little bit about the effects being above literacy and intelligence, but can you speak more generally about how related these two things are?
So that's one of the mysteries that people in my field are trying to grapple with. So about 2/3 of children who get a diagnosis of dyscalculia or MLD also present with reading difficulties. So then, you know, there's some great hypotheses. You could argue, well, children with dyslexia have difficulties in linking letters to sounds. So maybe it's all about linking symbols to their reference. It turns out that that hypothesis doesn't work. So far, there's been more evidence that they're dissociated rather than that there's a common cause. But I still think there must be something about the cognitive system of those children that makes them vulnerable in general to these two different types of disabilities. What it is, I don't know. I mean, one thing that we've looked at and others have looked at is phonological awareness seems to be very strongly correlated with children's arithmetic fluency. And one of the reasons we think that is that maybe arithmetic facts are stored in a phonologically based long-term memory. And there's been some associations between that. And that might explain some of the commonalities, but honestly, I think nobody at this point has a good account for any type of common cause. Right now, all we can say is they co-occur very frequently.
One last question. I was wondering about the details details of the dot test that you had mentioned. Because I feel like that there's other factors which could be impacting these scores. So for instance, if you look at a picture that has more dots, the average size of the dots has to be smaller just to fit more in your screen. Or you could make all the dots the same size, in which case one with less dots would just have a lower percentage of the screen being a different color. And so I wonder if anyone has tried to account for those sorts of factors in the dot test.
It's a great question. So the answer is that when you're comparing two arrays, you can never, it's physically impossible, to get a condition where the two arrays only differ in number. So what that creates is always an incongruent stimuli or a congruent stimuli. And I didn't have time to go into this, but we have some work to suggest that dyscalculics are particularly impaired when there's a conflict, let's say, between the stimulus size and the area. So when the larger array of dots has the smaller overall area, that's when they really struggle. So it seems to be then, in order to complete those tasks, that children with low numeracy skills, where presumably the numerical magnitude signal is weak, are seeking to use those other cues in order to form their decision. And I think the field is moving increasingly towards the recognition that when you're dealing with non-symbolic number discrimination tasks, that you're always having multiple cues that interact and inform the decision.
Okay.